Will democracy survive the next couple of years?
And essentially we are the same.
And there are so many needs that Minnesota has.
What people are saying they need right now.
Access to Democracy is made possible in part by a donation from Firefly Credit Union. Firefly is the new name of U.S. Federal Credit Union, which has proudly served the financial needs of the greater Twin Cities community since 1925. At Firefly, we guide our members forward and give them the power to chase dreams by delivering the financial solutions they need to get ahead. From checking accounts to mortgages, we'll light the way. We are Firefly Credit Union, and this is life illuminated. By Thomson Reuters, providing legal professionals with intelligence, technology, and human expertise they need to find trusted answers. Thomson Reuters, the answer company. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And Dr. Charles Crutchfield of award-winning Crutchfield Dermatology in Eagan. Acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians, a Minnesota native who trained at the Mayo Clinic, Dr. Crutchfield personally treats all patients and states that experience counts and quality matters. Crutchfield Dermatology, look good, feel great, with beautiful skin.
Hello, and welcome to Access to Democracy. I'm Dane Smith. I'm your guest host. I had a long career in the Twin Cities in journalism as a newspaper reporter working for the Pioneer Press and the Star Tribune, and for the last 12 years I was the president and now I'm senior fellow at Growth and Justice, an organization that was really focused on a broader prosperity for our state. We, like many business leaders, community leaders, are extremely concerned about economic inequality, disparities, regional, about climate change, and these issues really are driving the headlines in our community, and most people of goodwill realize that we need to take action. So it's a real pleasure to have as our guest today Kevin Lindsey, who is a former commissioner for our Human Rights Department for 8 years. He served under Governor Dayton. Thank you for that service.
Thank you,
Kevin. And recently he was named CEO of the Minnesota Humanities Center. And so we're going to talk a little bit about humanities, about equity, about justice, and let's just get rolling here with maybe a look back at your career. I know you've done, before you became Commissioner of the Human Rights Department, you were involved in the Diversity and Inclusion Council, working with suspensions in schools and so forth. But that was a long term of service you had for 8 years, helping watch as a watchdog around discrimination. Tell me about, if you will, what you're proudest of in that term of service, and what got accomplished, and where we're headed.
Sure. Thanks, Dane. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the Department of Human Rights. So some of your audience may not know that the Minnesota Department of Human Rights is relatively unique when you consider other states around the country. First off, it is a member of the governor's cabinet. That is not the case in other states. And it also has responsibilities that cuts across in investigating in a wide variety of different areas. So we can investigate administratively complaints of discrimination in employment, similar to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission at the federal government. We can do investigations in the area of housing, similar to housing and urban development. We can investigate matters concerning education, similar to the Justice Department in coordination with the Department of Education, and again, similar to the Department of Justice, issues concerning public access and public services. Mm-hmm. So
I remember as a journalist hearing that the department was a little bit neglected and underinvested in before Governor Dayton, that there was a backlog of cases. That was something you inherited, right?
There was a significant backlog of cases, and About 10 years prior to Governor Dayton taking office, the department was given the authority by the Minnesota legislature to actually make a determination to dismiss cases, because if they did not feel they had sufficient resources, they could dismiss a case. So it's not to say that they didn't think that the case had merit or wasn't worthy of investigation. They would look to see whether they had sufficient resources.
So there are many cases of probable or outright discrimination that were just simply not being investigated because of a lack of resources.
So yes, the year before I started as commissioner, the department investigated 225 cases, and they had dismissed more than 550 cases.
Wow.
So that was no investigation at all. So in the 8 years within the Dayton administration, that was one of the things we were very proud of as a department, is that we doubled the number of investigations. We did somewhere on the neighborhood about 2,500, and in the 8 years prior it was just over 1,000. And we ceased dismissing any cases for lack of resources. Now, we might have dismissed a case because we felt that it didn't have merit, but we investigated every case that came to the department. One of the other things at this point in time, which was unique, and again this goes to this issue of what was going on around the country, is that we had issues concerning photo identification and whether that should be a requirement for people to be able to vote. And then we also had a constitutional amendment concerning same-sex marriage. So the department facilitated community conversations around the state on those issues, and we allowed folks to ask questions on both sides of that respective issue and to let people really understand what it would really mean if this language, which was being proposed to be added to the Constitution, what that would mean for Minnesotans. Minnesota was the only state that year to defeat such an initiative on photo ID.
I remember this well. And we were one of the first states to defeat a marriage amendment.
Correct.
One that we actually may have been instrumental in Minnesota in what followed next, which was legalization of same-sex marriage all over the country.
No, I think that's right. I think it was kind of a domino effect. And at that point in time, we were also having a conversation about bullying within our state. And bullying. The governor appointed me to the bullying task force, and there was an opportunity to partner with my good friend, Commissioner Casilius, within the Department of Education, and a host of people around the state to see how we could strengthen Minnesota school bullying law. So out of that process, the statute got changed. Commissioner Casilius and I sat on the School Safety Technical Assistance Council, providing guidance to students and principals and officials within schools on how to ensure we have a safe and supportive school.
Progress on many fronts. Also disabilities too, right?
Yes, there was significant work which was done there. There was an Olmsted task force. Yes, we do have an Olmsted County, but it refers to Olmsted versus LC, a United States Supreme Court case. And the effort of the administration there within Olmsted was really to ensure people with disabilities were given opportunities to be fully integrated in all aspects of life. So we were taking a look at what was going on in education and in employment. We were taking a look at see what was going on in housing, what was going on in transportation. A lot of work still needs to be done within that area, but we really partnered and leveraged conversations that we were having in other areas with what was trying to be accomplished in the space of Olmsted. So an example of that would be when we set and adjusted workforce participation goals in construction. We would have seminars as to the accommodation needs, even though there was a lot of that conversation already happening within building inspectors. That extra layer of conversation, I think, was very helpful. One of the little secrets, I think, of the U.S. Bank Stadium, it is viewed by a lot of individuals within the disability community as being a better example of how to create these large stadiums. It's not perfect, but it is far better than what had been done before.
Didn't we make some real progress in terms of minority hiring around the stadium and in Department of Transportation and for contractors who do trades and labor work?
Yes, we did. In 2011, when we looked to see who was doing work for the state of Minnesota on construction projects, we saw that there were great racial disparities occurring, and we also saw very low participation for women. So one of the things that the department can do is to work with education, it can work with unions, it can work with community groups, and work with contractors to increase opportunities for women, people of color, individuals with disabilities to work within the construction field. And we specifically set goals to try and increase participation for people of color and then also for women. So from 2011 to 2016, we moved from 11% of the participation for state projects for people of color to a participation rate of over 26.5%. And then for women, we saw it also grow from 3% in the 7-county metro to over 12% in that same period of time.
We just don't see, I don't recall seeing this kind of progress in the headlines. The headlines have typically been about, and they should be, about the remaining disparities, and they're severe. Educational attainment, income, wealth, home ownership, you name it. The racial disparities in Minnesota are embarrassing. Give a kind of a assessment of, given the progress that you have described, which I think is encouraging, how much farther we have to go. I know that when you were commissioner and under Governor Dayton, the whole issue of racial equity was elevated, but many people still believe, and I think they make a good case, that we're still not as applied as we should be in this great struggle.
No, I think that's absolutely right. So when I was talking about construction, I was talking about a sliver within the whole area of construction, because we were only talking about the work in which the state of Minnesota was the owner of the project.
Right, and there's
so
a
there's
whole
a
private
lot,
sector out there.
There's a whole lot of other governmental entities,
Right.
and there's a whole, and as you
Yes.
say, the private sector.
Right.
So to that question, yes, how do we take the examples of what is working well and then scale them up? And how do we learn within a particular industry how to replicate things? And to that point, I do appreciate you talking about the governor and trying to do more within the space on race. So the Diversity and Inclusion Council, the governor had asked the Department of Human Rights to take an assessment of how all the administrative agencies were doing in hiring and contracting, and then working with the public to ensure the public was at the table with government. So for the very first time, we have a Minnesota governor signing an executive order, not being ministerial and saying it should be an affirmative action council, but it should be a diversity and inclusion council, and especially the emphasis on inclusion, making sure that we're truly being inclusive within our hiring practice, truly being inclusive in our contracting practices, truly being inclusive and having conversations which develop public policy.
Right.
So all the agencies within the governor's cabinet were then required to develop diversity and inclusion plans and to start to implement them. And I would say we made progress. We saw for the very first time a chief inclusion officer for the state being hired a year and a half after the executive order was signed by Governor Dayton. We saw recruiting efforts being coordinated with other governmental units, which had not happened before. And we also saw the publication of data, which is also important because you have to have trust.
Yes.
And then in the area that one of the areas I was primarily responsible for within that space was growing the training in the area of civic engagement. So it's no surprise that I was actually here at Thomson Reuters about 2-3 years ago, talking about the work that was being done on civic engagement and embedding practices for agencies to be involved in that, working really with community and building trust. Now, the reality is this is just starting.
Right.
We have some definitely work to do within this area. And one of the things that we would say within the cabinet is no one is as smart as all of us. So to this extent that we're excluding communities from being part of that, we're losing out the wisdom of those communities. And oftentimes the people who have the best solutions are the people who are being regulated.
Right.
So why wouldn't we listen to the people who are being impacted by policy decisions?
Exactly.
It seems simple, straightforward, but it is really revolutionary.
We hear the same thing from business leaders. They're discovering that when people of color, when there's more inclusiveness and decision making in their own organizations, they thrive.
Correct.
There's a new world out there. It's more diverse. Minnesota, I know when I came here in 1971 was, I think, less than 2% of people of color. We were one of the whitest states in the union. I think our rate of growth and diversity has been among the highest in the country. The rate of growth, of course, we're still not among the top 10 diverse states, but we're moving fast. And what's interesting to me is that we're thriving as this diversity increases. Minnesota is still one of the most successful states in terms of business creation, development, and we have a vibrant, thriving economy. And our work at Growth and Justice, of course, really focuses on the benefits and assets that come from realizing all our human potential.
Right.
Which is a good segue to the Minnesota Humanities Center, your new job. What do you mean by the humanities? I always thought of it as those courses in college that weren't math and science.
Right. So I had a feeling you might ask that question, so I actually found the definition for the humanities in the National Endowment of Humanities statute. So it says the term humanities includes, but is not limited to, I knew you would appreciate that coming from a lawyer, the study and interpretation of the following: language, both modern and classical, linguistics, literature, history, jurisprudence, philosophy, archaeology, comparative religion, ethics, the history and criticism and theory of the arts, those aspects of the social science which have a humanistic content and employ humanistic methods, and the study and the application of the humanities to the human environment. And it still goes on for another 2-3 sentences, Dane. So let me say this, right? Here's how I understand the humanities. The humanities is how we understand each other through storytelling. Sometimes it's religion, sometimes it's history, sometimes it's literature, but it really is how we understand and make sense of our world on a human basis.
That's the best explanation I've heard. And it has some obvious connotations around equity. So this is similar to the work you've been doing. What are you bringing to the Humanities Center? How do you hope to steer that ship from where it's been?
I think it's the interconnectedness piece, right? And this is really important. Dr. King talks about I can't be as much as I can be unless I truly recognize how all of our lives are interconnected and intertwined. Right. So to the extent that that individual is stepping on my neck in the proverbial ditch, right? He can't be what he can be until I can be what I can be.
Beautiful.
So to this piece, we're seeking to set the table. We talk about 3 C's at the humanities: convene, connect, and serve as a catalyst. We seek to convene people on respective issues. We seek to help them connect with one another, and we hope to spark change through those convenings and connections.
Okay.
So when we're talking about change from an environmental standpoint, or if we're talking about change concerning infrastructure, even the demographic change, you really articulated well sort of the dilemma which is before Minnesota. The present has been so good to Minnesota and been a very strong educational state, and they've been able to leverage that. But the amount of change which is happening belies the fact of the need to actually take steps now. It's awfully hard to store up for the winter when it's 80, 90 degrees out, but you need to do that.
Right.
And that winter, that change is coming. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be a bad thing.
Right.
But it does mean that we might have to do some things differently.
Yeah. Give me some examples of some specific activities that the Humanities Center is involved in, or initiatives that are coming up.
Sure.
New things we can look for.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple. One in this context of sort of political policy area. So we have been partnering with the Pollution Control Agency, Agriculture, Department of Natural Resources, and the Department of Health. And we also have brought into the space the Minnesota History Center as well, or History Society as well. And what we have been doing is we've been talking about water.
Wow.
So we have put together We Are Water, and we have storytelling which exists of individual Minnesotans talking about their experience of water over time. And again, as a convener, we're not necessarily saying this piece of statute should be passed or that one, but we do set the table. And I believe facts matter. I know some people don't, but I believe facts matter.
Pro-facts. I'm
so,
pro-facts.
so to that extent, We like to try and give people real information in a way in which they can feel that they can trust it, and then they can make an informed decision about the public policy going forward.
Well, you're venturing kind of outside the humanities into science there, and environmental science for sure, right? That's okay though.
Well, if we talk about civics and jurisprudence and how law develops, there is going to be a little bit of an overlap within that space. Another one that we have been working on, why treaties matter. So we have been talking about each of the treaties which has been signed by the indigenous people within this state. We have put together a traveling exhibit, again, going around the state. There's one now at the state capitol, which is one of our permanent
I've seen that.
Exhibits.
It's impressive.
And we've now also been trying to incorporate that within schools all throughout the state. So again, seeking to also increase humanities instruction within schools and within colleges.
Good luck in this work. This is kind of a different direction, it sounds like, from the previous work the Humanities Center has done. I've been to the beautiful facility you have over there on the east side of St. Paul. I know you've been a catalyst for humanism in general, and so I think it does fit with your previous work, and it also fits very much with what the work that Growth and Justice has been doing on equity, around connecting people, around civic engagement, and kind of positive, constructive response to these inequalities and disparities, concern about resentment of immigrants, and so forth. And I know that you recently joined the board of Growth and Justice. Can you talk a little bit about how that fits with your previous work in human rights and the humanities too?
Yeah, I think what drew me to the board of Growth and Justice was the Minnesota Equity Blueprint.
Yes.
So instead of being siloed, being intentional in crossing several areas and trying to bring connection. Again, when I was at the state, one of the things I was surprised at, and I'm not quite sure, as a political science major, I shouldn't have been as surprised, but I was really surprised by how siloed things had become.
Right.
And to this extent, I remember wanting to weigh in on a conversation about human trafficking, and my friends in the public safety were curious as to why the Commissioner of Human Rights would care about human trafficking, just to underscore that point for you.
Yeah.
So the thing which I appreciate from Growth and Justice is being intentional in saying this is not sort of a Thief River Falls. It has no impact on what's going on in St. Paul, or what's going on in Sleepy Eye has no impact on St. Cloud. We as a whole state are connected together. And when we talk about infrastructure development, and we must be talking about education. When we're talking about education infrastructure, how that impacts our environment, that also needs to be taken into consideration. And Growth and Justice does a really nice job of setting the table, listening to the public, weaving back in recommendations, and making it holistic.
Right. And the blueprint, of course, is a work in progress. It will be a substantial and comprehensive public policy agenda for the state, not just for the legislature, but for business leaders, for community leaders, nonprofit leaders, philanthropies, everyone. And everyone ought to be invested somehow in this battle for a broader prosperity and an economy that serves everyone, and reverses these trends that we're seeing around concentration of wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands, and stubborn racial disparities, and then on top of it, climate action and climate change, which often has been separated, as you say, in silos, and now we're finally beginning to see a lot of thinkers and doers realizing the interconnectedness of equity and climate action. And it's encouraging that you're involved with the environmental aspect of this with your water project, which also is connected to climate action. Actually, there's so many threats to our quality of our water that are part of the climate action story.
Well, we are definitely talking about climate instability, and we're in the process. I can't unveil it tonight, but soon we'll be unveiling sort of community conversations which we will be having on climate instability.
Oh,
the
good.
piece that you talk about on economics, I think is a key one. So when we're talking about the Forbes 400 and the top 400 individuals in America, combined wealth is $2.37 trillion. And over the last 20 years, the bottom 45% of our country, as far as economic wealth, has decreased. So you have the top 400, that 1.37 trillion almost being equivalent just to the bottom 45%.
Yeah, that is amazing.
That's just sort of just the growth.
That is just
within
a
that
staggering statistic. It's a good one to open any kind of presentation with, I think. 400 people have as much wealth as
Well,
the entire bottom half.
well, and I think that's the piece where it has been said often in the past that you can't really truly have a vibrant democracy if there is not some type of true economic opportunity for all. And Jefferson, I think, says there's nothing so unequal as to treat two people who are not equal the same.
Right.
And this notion that somehow we have to have equal treatment in everything when things are so far disparate just undermines our democracy.
Right. We always know that there's been white backlash to every advance that has been made in this country. There's a lot being written right now on the 400th anniversary of slavery. New York Times has an astonishingly interesting and intriguing series about this. And I think Minnesotans have always thought of themselves as progressive and different from other states in terms of being broad-minded and tolerant and welcoming, but our own history is kind of challenged on that score as we learn more about it. And so
The 1619 Project, I think,
Yes.
is a fascinating project in having that conversation. And yes, I think one of the challenges for us for Minnesota is just having that conversation does not necessarily mean that the individual wishes to blame you
right.
and then never have to deal with you again. And in some ways, it is really seeking to have a real authentic relationship and a good relationship going forward.
Right. Well, I think that your leadership in this, I think, is helpful and instructive. You need to recognize the problem. You need to face up to the facts of centuries of slavery, Jim Crow, discrimination, segregation, exclusion, and just as one historian I saw describe it, in Minnesota, the problem is the cold shoulder. And when what's needed is a warm embrace, and also to dwell on the positive things that are happening and that are in the works on this. And I really think that combination that you have exemplified has helped.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, a lot of people, when they look at some of the work that we did in suspensions, they thought that we were really talking about separation out of the punishment kind of piece.
Right.
But really what we were getting at is, do we truly have a real connection with the students?
A real connection.
So that's really the piece.
Right. Well, that's a good note to wrap things up with. We're nearing the end of our time. I really appreciate your leadership for this state and your continued efforts at the Humanities Center. And for Access to Democracy, we'll sign off for now. Thank you very much for watching.